Very often, people think project problems come from bad decisions. But beneath that is usually something more uncomfortable and not altogether so obvious. The construction industry is structured so that responsibility slowly becomes diluted across consultants, contractors, subcontractors, approvals, timelines, budgets, and most importantly of all of them, pressure. And once responsibility becomes fragmented, problems stop belonging to anyone properly. And that changes everything. People make projects that bring profit. But profits decide which projects get built and what people become. This is Bytnar Talks. People, projects, profits. Hi, and welcome to Bytnar Talks. I'm Piotr Bytnar, founder of Bytnar Limited, a chartered structural engineers practice founded in 2017. I spend a lot of time around projects where everyone involved is technically responsible for something. But funny enough, nobody feels fully responsible for the outcome. And that's an interesting environment to sit inside. Because on paper, and we all know paper will take all you put on it, accountability structures usually look clear. You know, we are all well used to the fact that there are scopes, clearly defined, maybe sometimes. There are approvals, the hoops everyone thinks we need to jump through. There are reporting lines, there are contracts, there are responsibilities assigned to different parties. It is all good on paper, in theory, and when we theorize about it, right? But very often, and I see it like on every single project I've ever seen, and there is nearly 1,000 of them, once pressure enters the system, reality becomes more complicated. People start protecting timelines, protecting budgets, protecting relationships, protecting exposure. And slowly but surely, responsibility starts moving. We all feel it's there somewhere, but where exactly? You see, the responsibility does not disappear completely, it just becomes harder to pin down. And I think most people who've worked around projects long enough recognize that feeling immediately. The feeling where everyone is still working, everyone is still communicating, everyone is still attending meetings, but underneath it all, something has started pretty much drifting apart. So welcome to Bytnar Talks. This is something worth thinking about, isn't it? I've been thinking about it for some time now, and it's such an elusive topic, and it is so easy to brush it all under the carpet. You know, if we delivered, we delivered. Let's move on. Construction is not an industry for dwellers, it is for doers. And don't we do? How do we do? For today's podcast, I have noted myself few aspects of it I would like to talk to you about. I'm sure at some point in time that you thought about it in one way or the other. I know that I did, every single time when things started going belly up. And there was no one to take the reins to get out of that mire. When I was preparing for this podcast, I noted a few points for myself to talk about, or questions rather. Things like, where is the responsibility hidden on the project? How do I see it often drifting? What could be the reasons for the state of the game? Could it be the culture? If it's the culture, what do we incentivize so it gets us in a pickle? What does it reveal? Is it just human nature? Well, most organizations talk about responsibility as though it's a fixed thing. A role, a title, a signature on a piece of paper, a contractual obligation. And to be fair, some of that matters. Projects do need structure. They do need defined ownership. They do need decision-making pathways. Without those things, complexity becomes unmanageable very, very, very quickly. But what's interesting is how often responsibility starts looking very different once projects move from planning into pressure. Because the visible structure usually isn't the full structure. What really shapes responsibility on projects is who carries risk, who controls the information, who absorbs delay, who gets blamed publicly, who signs approvals, who owns uncertainty, and who has the power to stop momentum. And those are not always the same people. That's where projects become interesting, because responsibility on paper and responsibility under pressure often are completely different things. You see this a lot once projects begin accelerating. At the start, alignment feels relatively easy. Everyone's happy on the project, sipping coffees and throwing jokes around. Everyone attends kick-off meetings. Everyone agrees on objectives. Everyone talks about collaboration. And genuinely, most people mean it. But projects are easy to align around before consequences arrive. The real test comes later, when timelines tighten, when coordination starts slipping, when procurement creates pressure, when variations start appearing, when commercial exposure increases. That's where the structure gets tested properly. And usually, that's where the gaps begin appearing. Not because people suddenly become incapable of doing what they do best, because complexity starts exceeding the coordination capability underneath the project. That distinction matters, because most organizations mistake activity for control. There's movement, there's reporting, there are meetings, there's communication, but underneath it, ownership is becoming less clear. And once ownership becomes unclear, problems tend to stay unresolved longer than they should. That's where drift begins. When I think about it, well, the drift usually starts quietly. No one just starts doing whatever they like to do. It's little things that start pushing the needle in the wrong direction. It's not the dramatical stuff. Not with one major event. It's usually through accumulation of different things. A detail gets accepted just to keep things moving. Well, haven't we done it all? A drawing issue gets parked for later. Well, it seems like the typical occurrence on every single project. A coordination clash becomes someone else's package. Yeah, if you don't see it, it's not there, is it? An approval gets rushed because the program is tightened. Yeah, we've been there. Nobody ignores the issue intentionally. That's important. Most people on projects are trying to do the right thing, but they are often doing it inside systems that reward momentum more than clarity. And eventually, you start seeing the same pattern. People become responsible for protecting their position rather than resolving the underlying issue. The consultant protects the scope, the contractor protects the program, the subcontractor protects costs, the client protects budget exposure, the supplier protects procurement timelines. And slowly, the original problem becomes secondary. The system starts optimizing for survivability. Never mind, you know what I mean, instead of alignment. That's usually the point where projects begin carrying hidden risk. Not because nobody cares, because everybody is operating under different pressures. And what makes this difficult is that those pressures rarely announce themselves clearly. You usually feel them before you see them. Conversations become shorter, decisions become faster, people stop challenging assumptions quite as openly. You notice teams talking more about protecting timelines than understanding implications. The reporting still says things are manageable, but confidence feels different. You'll recognize that if you've been around projects long enough, that moment where everyone is technically still aligned but operationally something feels slightly off. And the difficult part is that projects can operate like that for surprisingly long time. Sometimes months, sometimes in parts up until the end. Because visible failure tends to arrive later than organizational drift. That's one of the most important things people miss. Projects drift before they fail, and responsibility often drifts first. And I think this is the point where the conversation changes, because at first glance, responsibility feels like a people issue. But underneath it, it's often a systems issue. What looks like poor accountability is frequently fragmented incentives. What looks like avoidance is often pressure distortion. What looks like confusion is usually misalignment across decision-making structures. The project didn't suddenly lose control, the environment slowly stopped supporting clear ownership. And once that happens, the decision quietly usually starts slipping. You see it in meetings, conversations become more cautious, language become less direct, people start speaking in ways that protect optionality. The reporting still looks controlled, but confidence feels different, if there's any left. And experienced people notice that very quickly, because pressure changes behavior before it changes outcomes. That's worth sitting with. A lot of organizations believe responsibility is primarily about governance, but governance without operational clarity doesn't hold very well under pressure. That's the issue. You can have reporting structures, approval workflows, escalation procedures, technical standards, commercial controls, and still struggle badly with ownership. Because systems are not just processes. Systems are behavior under pressure. That changes how you understand project control entirely. Because suddenly, the question isn't who is technically responsible. It becomes, does the environment actually support responsible behavior? Very different question, and often a much more uncomfortable one, because some environments quietly discourage visibility, not intentionally but structurally. People become afraid of slowing momentum, afraid of escalating concerns, afraid of becoming associated with delay, and over time risk becomes normalized. That's where projects become dangerous, not when people stop working hard, when systems stop absorbing honesty properly. And let's be fair here. You may be honest because someone else didn't see something that was technically overlooked and it will lead to the wrong place. But once you say it out loud, the other side usually will protect themselves from looking bad. And it becomes, this sort of relationship drift that starts occurring. And obviously, the other side can easily flip it the other way around, that is already being looked at, and that you, in this case, look a little bit over-enthusiastic, let's say. So there's always this diplomatic or human-like thing about it. And it's very difficult to navigate that, especially in the rooms where every single part of them, all of the consultants, architects, clients, representatives, whatever you name it, they all come together once at the project, and if there's no relationship of togetherness, or maybe that extreme candor, if you cannot voice all of them things, then there is a trouble, and there will be problems along the way. Because you may see something that someone else is already working on, but you may actually see something that no one considered before. And if you cannot easily and openly talk about it, well, then there is a problem. And that leads me to responsibility and in organizational culture. You see, it's pretty much that really. And how can you cherish and how can you develop culture on projects where everyone comes together, assemble together, then disassemble, then the other project is completely different with different people, right? It's tough. Something else projects reveal very quickly is culture. Not the culture written in value statements, the operational culture, the real one. Because projects expose what organizations actually reward, not what they claim to reward. If speed consistently matters more than coordination, people adapt to speed. If reporting matters more than reality, people adapt to reporting. If raising concerns creates friction, concerns arrive later. That's human behavior. Structures shape behavior faster than intentions do. And eventually, culture forms around pressure. You start seeing defensive communication, fragmented ownership, selective visibility, reduced challenge, and quiet avoidance. The thing that I already mentioned. And it's usually not because people are weak, but because system condition behavior over time. That's one of the reasons projects become such accurate stress tests. They reveal whether organizational culture remains healthy once pressure becomes operational. Anybody can appear aligned when complexity is low. Capability shows up when complexity increases. That's the real test. And this is where a lot of organizations struggle without fully realizing it, because they often scale revenue, headcount, project volume, operational activity faster than they scale coordination capability. So growth creates hidden fragilities, and projects expose it, usually gradually, then suddenly. What makes this difficult is that projects are rarely driven by one objective. They're driven by overlapping incentives, and incentives shape behavior faster than policies do. A program under commercial pressure behaves differently. A contractor operating on tight margin behaves differently. A consultant worried about liability behaves differently. A developer managing investor expectation behaves differently. A facilities team inheriting future risk behaves differently. And none of those pressures are necessarily irrational. That's the important part. The visible explanation is usually real, but incomplete. Because underneath all of it, systems reward certain behaviors. Speed gets rewarded, certainty gets rewarded, cost reduction gets rewarded, short-term progress gets rewarded, but long-term coordination quietly, that's harder to measure. So organizations often scale capacity faster than capability. More projects, more reporting, more activity, but not necessarily stronger in alignment. And projects expose that gap very, very, very quickly. What's interesting is how often people recognize the problem privately long before they address it publicly. You'll hear things like, "We'll manage it later. Let's just get through this stage first. We can't reopen that now. Everyone already knows the pressure we're under." And individually, those decisions can sound reasonable. That's what makes them difficult. Because drift rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. It usually feels practical, temporary, understandable, until eventually the accumulation becomes visible. And by that stage, responsibility has often become fragmented across too many moving parts to resolve cleanly. That's when recovery becomes political. I think projects are effectively life stress tests for organizational maturity. Because when pressure increases, responsibility either becomes clearer or more fragmented. And that usually tells you a lot about the system underneath. Strong environments tend to make ownership visible early. Weak environments tend to make ownership political. That's a very different thing. In a healthy system, concerns can be raised early, uncertainty can be discussed openly, coordination gaps become visible quickly, and decisions stay connected to consequences. In weaker systems, though, reporting becomes defensive, escalation becomes uncomfortable, people protect themselves, and responsibility starts drifting sideways. And eventually, nobody feels fully empowered to stop the problem properly. That's where small technical issues start becoming larger organizational issues. And by that stage, recovery usually becomes far more expensive than prevention ever would have been. What's fascinating is how predictable this pattern actually is. Different sectors, different project types, different organizations, but similar behavioral signals all over the place. Because pressure creates recurring patterns, you usually see it first in coordination, then communication, then decision quality, then trust. And once trust starts weakening, systems slow down dramatically. Not always visibly, but operationally. People start double-checking, Approvals become cautious, conversation become filtered, teams stop assuming alignment, and complexity increases very quickly from there. That's why trust is operational, not emotional. Operational. It affects the speed and quality of coordination across the entire environment. Something else worth recognizing is how much pressure changes human behavior. Because most people don't arrive at projects intending to avoid responsibility, right? Usually the opposite. Most people care deeply about delivering good work, but pressure compresses things. Timelines tighten, meetings increase, reporting intensifies, decisions accelerate, and eventually people stop managing the wider system and start managing immediate survival. That's human, not malicious, human. And this is why capability matters so much. Capability is not just technical competence. It's whether organization can maintain coordination, clarity, and decision quality under pressure. That's the real test. Not where systems work when conditions are easy, whether they still work when complexity increases. And this is where leadership becomes extremely important. Not performative leadership, not a good talk, all mouth, no trousers, singing, does not cut it. Operational leadership does. The kind that creates enough psychological safety for difficult truths to surface early. Because organizations usually don't fail from lack of intelligence, they fail from delayed visibility. People sense the issue, but the system didn't allow the issue to become visible early enough. That's the difference. And once you understand that, a lot of project behavior starts making more sense. The silence, the hesitation, the delayed escalation, the defensive reporting, the reluctance to reopen decisions. These are often pressure responses, not a capability absence. Although over time, pressure can absolutely erode capability too. This is very much the kind of complexity we spend time around at Bytnar. Not simply defects, not simply compliance, not simply technical reviews, not only designs, but understanding how visible issues connect back to system underneath. Because a lot of project problems become easier to deal with once they're visible early enough. If we think about it, we can find better ways to deliver. Before positions harden, before pressure compounds, before responsibility becomes fragmented, to me, a lot of the real value comes from creating clarity before situations become adversarial. That's usually where better outcomes begin, not through blame, through visibility, through coordination, through helping organizations recognize what pressure is doing to decision making before consequences fully materialize. Well, exposing the consequences for the temporary fixes or just moving things forward with the flow, I find is very helpful. Most of environments don't actually need more activity. They need a clearer understanding. They often need calmer thinking under complexity, perhaps thinking ahead more than reactive. That's where capability becomes visible, and that's what I try to accomplish in my everyday practice. If we can think or look ahead in 2-3 steps and start talking about those 2-3 steps ahead rather than reacting or letting things slide for too long, then that usually solves 99.5% of issues on any given project. But to be able to do that, you need to have a team where trust and openness are the biggest values that everyone sees. Not a confrontation, a value of open communication. So when we ask who takes responsibility at the end of the day, the answer is usually more complicated than people expect. Because responsibility on projects isn't just about contracts, although when gavel hits the block, it perhaps is. To me, it's about incentives, pressure, coordination, capability, communication, operational maturity, and whether systems support clear ownership when things become difficult. We build in buildings, not rockets. But we usually build them with a new team every single time. You see, most major project issues don't appear suddenly. They accumulate quietly while responsibility becomes increasingly fragmented. And once you notice that, you start seeing projects differently. Maybe even you can react when the project stakeholders can be candid with each other. Often, what looks like a technical issue often sits inside an organizational issue. What looks like poor communication is often misalignment underneath. And what looks like isolated failure is usually system behavior under pressure. That's why projects often reveal more than they intend to. They expose how organizations actually function when complexity becomes real. They reveal what gets rewarded, what gets protected, what gets ignored, and whatever capability can sustain pressure without drifting. At the end of the day, systems shape behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. You know the saying, how does a company bankrupt? Not immediately. Gradually. Then all at once. Usually this situation becomes much easier to manage when clarity arrives early enough. Before assumptions harden, before positions become defensive, before pressure starts driving decision instead of judgment. And a lot of that comes down to whether organizations have the capability structures to absorb complexity properly. That's often where the real work starts. Because once visibility disappears, recovery becomes much harder. And once responsibility becomes fragmented, trust usually follows. So a lot of this is really about recognizing drift early enough to respond before systems become reactive. That's where the strongest environments tend to separate themselves. The visible issue is rarely the first issue, and eventually, what gets rewarded gets repeated. Well, there's always more than one way to look at these things, and they rarely sit neatly together. So if this shifted your perspective even slightly, that's a good place to leave it. Thanks for staying with me, and I'll see you in the next one.